I would also like to thank you all for taking the time to come out this evening. I've always believed, especially now that we're living in times that could use some levity. And as a result, my work really strives to uplift, a little to abuse, evoke nostalgia, and above all, to elicit a smile. So I hope we all have a lighthearted and pleasant time this evening. There is really a lot to see, quite aside from my art, of course. Maribel has an incredible collection at Antique Resources of museum quality pieces, and this is the kind of place you can just get completely absorbed in. I'm quite honored to have my art featured this evening, and I'd like to thank those individuals who have really worked tirelessly for many, many hours and put in incredible effort to make this evening possible. I would like to thank, of course, Marcia Bogue, who's been just incredible and relentless on my behalf in Chicago, and Maribel, who's been kind enough to provide this incredible venue for this evening. And at the same time, I'd like to thank those individuals who've helped Maribel, Tony, Lynn, Carlos, Melissa. Heartfelt thanks to you all, and let's look forward to an evening of smiles.
Thank you, Harry. I do want to mention that this is Harry and his wife, Judy. Where's Judy? This is their first time in Chicago from Toronto,
yes.
Correct? They're visiting.
It's shameful.
So I'd like everybody to welcome them to Chicago and wish them a nice visit.
Thank you. Thank you.
The other thing I want to mention about Harry is that his roots are in architecture and graphic design. And then in the mid-70s, Harry earned the Canada Council for the Arts Award for an innovative environmental graphic concept, highlighting the power of color and design to uplift spaces. Currently, Harry continues to inspire and elevate us through his artwork, crafting colorful details paintings that have come to be known as the art of whimsy. And they're designed to put a smile on people's faces. One of Harry's goals is to exhibit his work to a wider audience and put even more smiles, which is why he's here in Chicago. However, to become better acquainted with his artwork, I'm going to start asking Harry to tell us a little bit about his background.
Yes, I don't want to bore you with a lot of detail of background, but there is a Chicago connection, a sort of obscure, older connection. Some parts of my curriculum while studying architecture, and which also encouraged my development in art, was taught by individuals who were colleagues of associates of the New Bauhaus in Chicago. Now, the New Bauhaus was an offshoot of the original Bauhaus in Germany. And later it became the Institute of Design in Chicago and part of IIT at this point. And the Bauhaus curriculum included a lot of other things other than architecture. It had photography and graphic design and typography and all kinds of disciplines. Following this, however, and this is the part that gets to the artwork, ironically at the same time, our architectural instruction was taking place in a period that was known, we didn't know it at the time, we were living in it, but it was known as New Brutalism. And my reaction to that period and to that instruction would lead to my architectural pieces, the flat buildings and totems, which you can see around, and my attempt to bring some color and magic to buildings. And that's because brutalism was often known for its use of concrete and lack of color. And in some cases, it could be very, very unfriendly. There was what was called bush-hammered ribbed concrete, which was sharp and, and really, you couldn't even walk against a wall. So at the same time, there were many architects who used precast concrete at the same time, which really was not considered brutalist and which was really incredibly creative and aesthetically pleasing. So this is a reaction that we had at that time, and I developed by feeling that color in design could enhance and uplift the living environment. Soon after graduating, And while practicing architecture, the government of Canada, as Maribel mentioned, accepted my proposition, and I received the Canada Council for the Arts Award to study. At that time, I termed it environmental graphics. Apparently, it's a term that was not used or even understood at that time.
Harry, I noticed we have some artwork back here, and as I was enjoying some of his other artwork, it's very figural. And I was curious to know if the characters are invented or they're actual characters, and the backgrounds, are they?
Well, there's a number of what I call Harry's friends, and these are really old friends of mine and drawings that I've been doing over the years. All the work is really based on observation, especially the small details, which I've always enjoyed putting into the work. Details like the pencil in the pocket. But there's also often recollections, and those recollections may need some research to back it up, get some details, and just to get some additional images that are accurate to the time. There is for example, Walking Louis, which is 3 aisles over and to the left, where all the dog material is. Walking Louis is an example where we were in England in a restaurant. I saw this particular woman, and I decided to sketch her on the inside of a matchbook. And she later became Penelope Pebblebottom. Now, that's not always possible. For one thing, there are no matchbooks anymore. So I have to go through memory, and this is where, you get it. I enjoy capturing what I've always called the oddly ordinary. So my characters may appear odd on canvas, but only until you actually come across some of them in everyday, activities, and then they become oddly familiar. They're based on years of pen and ink sketches, and as I mentioned, they're really my old friends. They're treated with great affection. There's no offense ever intended, and the same characters, often in Damon Runyon-esque type of fashion, they weave in and out of my work. They pop up in street scenes and in large canvases and in the individual pieces. I'm told quite often by people familiar with my work, they may be on a subway, they may be in a restaurant, they may see somebody and they say, I saw somebody that looked just like one of the people that you would draw. So they actually do exist. And my approach has always been to capture a moment and create a composite of time. Detail and subtlety are very important, and the obscure location of elements. And it's really for the viewer to sort of examine and discover. And I always introduce it in the work, and I do it in a way to engage the viewer and, just to delight the viewer when they sort of pick up on something. Then there's the composition and the creation of the pieces. And they're really developed because I feel they are produced, these are images that cannot be produced through traditional photography. The advantage of a painting is that I can introduce details that don't actually exist in any single setting. I can take elements that have been researched. In some cases, I have to recreate them. And they're placed unobtrusively. They don't look out of place, and they're really crucial, to the pieces. The underlying theme is always to create a piece that will engage and maybe amuse, evoke nostalgia, as we said, but always at least to elicit a smile.
Thank you, Harry. And one of the things we did was we asked Harry to talk about his 3 favorite pieces, which are here. So I will get out of the way so Harry can explain some of what we see.
Well, we have a Montreal news vendor, about 1956. This piece, interestingly enough, is one of the least whimsical but the most personal for me. So this is not only a painting of a news vendor, it's really a portrait of a neighborhood and of a community at a specific time. It's a neighborhood that some of you may know that the Canadian author Mordechai Richler has written many, many novels about. And there are many subtle details in this particular piece that are very specific to a particular community and neighborhood of Montreal. And I really painted it to evoke memories and nostalgia of that area. So to begin with, we have the vendor himself. And well, on his apron, you've got the Gazette, Montreal Gazette. It's still around today. It has been around for about 100 years. We have the streetcar conductor's change dispenser, which really required a lot of research. In fact, somebody told me recently that they had one of those when they had a newspaper route. And he had it for change. And I think it was really hard to get and even harder to find a picture of at this point. Then, of course, I stuck in some pencils and paper, just a little bit of detail to add some realism to the apron. And there's a detail that I will often focus on. You'll see in almost everything, and that is the sneakers and shoes. Then we have the newspapers themselves. Now, these mastheads were researched for the appropriate time period. In some cases, they had to be recreated from pieces that were gleaned from different views, different angles, different, here and there, and I had to put them together and sort of recreate them. The neighborhood is included a variety of immigrant groups served by ethnic papers. And 4 of these papers are actually specific to Montreal, La Presse, Le Devoir, and a couple of others. There's a lot in this one single, little painting. So we have a Kick Cola sign. Kick Cola would be recognized by a lot of older Canadians. Kick Cola was a beverage and was the original Canadian inexpensive alternative to the 2 colas, the 2 big colas. At the bottom, we have a wooden crate from beverages, and it has a logo for what was called Eskimo. Eskimo beverages is probably not known by people other than Montrealers at that time. It also happens to have been owned by cousins of mine. There is a very typical and distinctive sign in the window. These signs were in windows all the time. And the sign says Chambre à louer in French and Room to Let in English. Now we have haphazard, scattered debris. And even here, we have subtle elements to represent 2 distinctly popular brands of cigarettes in Montreal. One is the very popular Green Export A. Almost everybody smoked it, mainly, a lot of people who were working. It's quite a strong brand. And then behind it, I also painted the Players. In this case, I painted Players in a tin. So what you see in the back is an old tin. So as you can see, there's a lot to these, and a lot of thought that goes into them, and there's a lot to look at. And as you pick up on each thing, it just sort of gives you some pleasure in discovering them.
And Harry, I'm interested. What is the date on these papers?
The date is about 1956. I mean, it would span a few years, give or take, but that's the time that I sort of remember as a very small child, and that's when a lot of this was popular. That's when you had newspaper, kiosks still on the streets here and in New York, everywhere really. So it's sort of something that's disappeared, which is another reason why I thought it would be a nice idea to have. And I've always been fascinated by newspapers, newspaper kiosks. And one of the reasons I put it in, actually, in Taxi as well. So if we go to Sunday morning, now this is interesting. What you see is an image, and there is a lot to it, and there's a lot of thought behind it. So we spent a great deal of time in New York. Our son studied and worked in New York for many, many years. And I wanted to represent New York. But I didn't want to represent the typical hectic, fast-paced, impersonal one that people think of New York. I didn't want Times Square or Broadway. I wanted a more serene, peaceful, and quiet New York. So this is a quiet moment, really. This is a Sunday morning moment. And that being the case, it's also a Sunday Times moment. And what better way to represent New York? Nothing says New York, even though they're no longer around, as a checker cab. And nothing says New York like the Sunday Times. So this is a quiet, late fall morning. The painting itself is made up of 4 sort of sub-themes. Of course, you have the vendor and you have the kiosk with the newspapers. We have the car. We have the architecture. And we have a dog. So once again, we have subtle details. We have the sneakers. And if you look closely, you can almost see the texture of the rubber. Then there is the crushed Coke can under the rear tire. And once again, these are the kind of details that invite you to spend a little more time to enjoy the art. That way, there's always something you can look for that you may not expect to find. Now, we don't usually talk about challenges in executing a painting by the artist, but there were some challenges. One of them was illustrating headlights and getting, reflection and 3-dimensional and stuff. Reflections of autumn on the windshield. And one of the hardest things was the perspective of the checkered strips and making sure that you could actually see them and they actually look that way. And let's not forget the whimsy. In this case, you have somebody who's sending their dog out in a cab to pick up the paper. Best friends forever, BFF. When I considered doing this piece, I really considered it a challenge. It was going to be a study in whites. And that's what I really took it as, a study of whites. We have the white of the dog. We have the white of the snow. We also have the white of the low snow bank. We have the white of the melting snow. And then we have the pale white blue of the sky. So interpreting the visuals is going to be very interesting. I could just as easily have depicted this piece in summertime. But I felt it was important to pursue, and in any case, I really loved painting those boots. So something else that I wanted to impart here is a series of not so subtle stresses, something you wouldn't just notice without it being pointed out. We have the stress of the weather. You have the figure forward placing. You have hard to see, but there's, the smoke coming from, the vapor coming from the mouth. So you've got the stress of the weather. There's the stress on the leash. And of course, there's the stress of the dog attempting to, the dog's attempted action. And aside from all of that, as a bonus, I'm really glad that I was able to capture at the time a duffel coat. I'm sure all Chicagoans appreciate this, but especially as we switch over to lighter nylon Canada Goose and Patagonia, you don't see too many of these anymore, so at least there's something here that's captured for a while. So that's these 3, and what's interesting is that there's so much more as a backstory to what you see initially, which becomes interesting. I always felt I would let the art work for itself, and I don't mind speaking one-on-one, but I've, rarely, if ever, given a little talk on what it is. But I can understand that there are things about the pieces that, it's nice to know what went into it and some backstory to it.
So Harry, one of the things I noticed was you also have a friend that's a sculptor, Marceline, a life-size sculpture, and he came from a painting. How is it that you decided to go from the painting and make them into a sculpture?
So this really developed from a concept I had about considering these pieces as a large-scale installation. And they would be this size, they'd be cut-out figures, and they would be a backlit street scene behind them. So as a result, there was a lot of research, and this is where a lot of new concepts and thoughts sort of came in for my continuing, development in the art. Producing pieces involved two real new concepts for me. First, there was the product itself, the physical product, and that is a product from England. It's lightweight, it's aluminum on two sides of a plastic core, and it's very, very stable. Then there's the fabrication side, and it involves CNC or computer-assisted router outlining. It's almost like people thought that it was like laser stuff, and in some cases you can do it with laser, but it's really not necessary. So you have the shape. Now I had to prepare, of course, outline artwork that could be fed into the computer to produce the outline of these pieces. Finally, now that I had a physical outline, I had to develop a way of producing the final image. This I do by hand. So I'm doing it by hand using oil-based markers and paint. So what's interesting is that each of these are limited edition when it comes to the base, and they're all originals when it comes to the final art. So it's really sort of a combination of the two.
Another thing, we tried to get a sample of Harry's art, but we couldn't bring the totems. You have these totems, and if you look at that secretaire to your left, you'll see that there's a catalog there where you could see these totems. And the totems, and then there's also these flat paintings of mini buildings on satin canvas. And I noticed that they're Art Deco. Why Art Deco?
Well, Chicago really knows Art Deco. It's named after 1925, with the exhibition in Paris, Art Decorative, or Art Deco. And the thing is, the building, Art Deco itself is defined by elements that are very colorful, they're linear, they're geometric, they're sleek, they're streamlined. These are pretty glamorous descriptions for a building. So at that time, and actually an elderly couple at one of my shows explained this to me when they say, look at all those details and stuff, you know where they're from. So the truth is, in 1922, the discovery of King Tut's tomb in Egypt provided inspiration for exotic motifs and decorative elements from ancient civilizations on architecture, on jewelry, on furniture, on clothing. And so for me, it was a natural choice. If I was going to choose a magical building and something with color, it would be Art Deco. It certainly wasn't going to be, concrete and glass and stuff. And some of the buildings that we are seeing in Chicago are just phenomenal. They really are. That's why I say it's a shame that we haven't been here a lot earlier.
The other question I had was, why do you call your art whimsy? Why whimsy?
Well, that's an interesting story. I mean, first of all, as I said before, I believe we live in times that can use some levity. So I do create playful, observational art, for the most part. And they will amuse and evoke nostalgia and all the things we talked about in the other pieces. I should point out, as Coco Chanel said in the 20s, that a lot of serious work goes into successful frivolity. So, it shouldn't obscure the effort and the skill required to produce a piece. But there's another, probably the main reason that I chose whimsy is probably because I couldn't help myself, sort of thing. So the architecture and even a news vendor are not so whimsical, but even, of course, the buildings are very happy and colorful. Some are older, some are newer. The newer pieces The nature of the printmaking is sort of prints on demand, so they don't have dates. But the original art, which are acrylics on either hardboard or on canvas, many of them were done a few years ago. Once COVID hit, it was hard to have a studio and work at home and stuff like that, so there was a gap, and sort of things are starting to pick up again. So it's been a while, but fortunately they're not sort of time sensitive in terms of where I am today. A lot of them have to do, they're sort of timeless and have to do with past situations, past scenes. That's a good question. When I work on whimsy and I concentrate, and it takes a lot of time, and you lose track of time, I guess the best part of it is you don't watch the news. So in that respect, but otherwise it's really hard today. And it's become even more important, like some of these are years old. And even then I felt that we could use some levity and whimsy, and now even more so. There are things you can't even invent that are happening, that you can't even think of. So. I was always an art. I mean, I've always drawn all my life, and I'm sure this is not unusual, but I'd be doodling in class. In public school, I'd be doodling on my workbooks, on my textbooks. I'd be told by teachers, stop doodling, and I'd be told you're using up all this paper, So it was always there, and I would doodle unconsciously. If I got on the phone, I would just start doodling. I didn't know what it would end up as. I would just follow the line, and that's what happened. So I've always done that. Now, interestingly, I didn't mention it, but part of the School of Architecture actual practice is that you go on a field trips for a couple of weeks, twice for 2 years, in 2 separate years, and you're in a small Quebec village, and you're doing work that's on plan. It's outdoors and stuff. So that also contributed. Those were watercolors. What's interesting is that they were watercolors, and because they're done outdoors, they work very quickly. I never expected to produce detailed pieces. It just sort of happened as I did it, and I said, well, if I want people to see a particular thing, it's got to be accurate. So I ended up being far, far more accurate. So I got it doing it in earnest. We always had, after my architectural practice, we moved from Montreal to Toronto. We had a design and marketing and advertising agency. And so we worked at that for a long time. And when we retired from that, I was able to have the time to do this stuff in earnest, because it takes a lot of concentrated time. It's hard. People say, how long did it take you to do? And you don't do it all at one sitting. And also there's a lot of research in the middle of stuff. So if I'm doing I have 4 newspapers. There's one I don't have yet. I want to find Pravda, and I've got to look it up and find it and get it. And then I've got to find it in 1956. Not today. So all of that, so it's hard to figure that out. So it was really, I can almost say I had to be able to afford to paint before I was able to take the time to do it. And I was lucky that I painted what I liked to paint. So. There are actually organizations, there are authorities, that control true fine art prints. These prints are the most accurate you can get of an original. Now, people will often confuse, and I get into this discussion often, If you can afford the original, then please, by all means. But once the original is gone, then you know, there are people who still like that original was sold many years ago, but a lot of people still want to have it. So I developed what is the fine art. It's really a fine art process. It's controlled. There's only so many numbers. Once you limit the edition, you have that edition. You limit how many artist proofs you can do, how many, HC is called hors de commerce. That's if you're giving something away. So there's a real procedure, and you have to, the artist is involved in every step. And of course, it's hand signed, it's hand numbered, and hand controlled. Now, going back even to the 19th century, and even today, there are many artists who do not produce their own prints. We're talking printmaking as opposed to the original. Some people are very surprised at this. You'll see a lot of artists, you may even see a crest, a symbol, an embossed seal on the corner. There are studios that specialize in this. They themselves are artisans in their own right. In the 19th century and stuff, there were some very, very famous painters, and they actually were invited and they joined artisan groups. In some cases, they themselves learned how to do the printmaking, and in other cases, they just let the artisans develop it. Silk screening especially is a process by which a lot of it is done by professional studios who are really capable of doing it, because it's a combination of photography and blocking and, you know, screens and everything. But it has nothing to do with the art. So you mean if there's a Norval Morisot and it's a print, he did the art. The print is still his print and it's his art. So I always felt you should not be confused between the art and the production of the art. You know, the art and the process. They're not necessarily one and the same. I saw the sitcom, and I know the characters, but they did not come into play. I'm not sure they were using checkered cabs. I think they were using more modern cars. The checker cab hasn't been around for a while. When you think about it, I think they discontinued in late 40s or so. And they were extreme. First of all, they're really comfortable. I mean, I wish we had them. The only thing close are like the British cabs, and even they are the older-fashioned ones. And they were heavy. They weighed a ton. They were very inefficient. So they ultimately got rid of them, but what they replaced them with very often. And today, you know, you call an Uber and you don't know what you're going to get. You know, you may get a compact and they have no problem. They're, you know, trying to get 3 people in.
I want to thank Marcia, who's the one that came up with the concept of exhibiting artwork. And I want to thank Lynn Walsh from Lynn Walsh Communications. She was involved in sending newsletters and helping out, and I hope all of you got to meet her. She's a lovely lady. And Melissa Zeman from Bottles Up. So thank you, and make yourself at home.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming.